By means of specious and plausible words, they cunningly allure the simple-minded to inquire into their system. So here we must be warned. We know that the book of John, for instance, was written as a polemic against the Gnostics. St. Paul writes extensively against the Gnostics. We've covered that in many of my shows where much of the Bible, New Testament, is a warning against the Gnostics. The Nicene Creed is a warning against the Gnostics. It's the defense of Orthodox faith, smaller Orthodox faith against the Gnostics. Now, of course, what you have is evidence from within the New Testament that the Gnostics were in the church. They were clothed in the clothes of the church. They were in the words of the church, right? But these were wolves in sheep's clothing. And eventually they revealed themselves. They tried to draw others astray the way that they had gone astray. Misery loves company. So who was St. Irenaeus? So this one's going to be very hard-hitting. And I will tell you that once you look at the conclusions of Irenaeus, so do remember, John Calvin, as we've discussed, John Calvin wrote a long letter to the Bishop Sadoleto, and John Calvin explicitly stated that his Calvinism and that Protestantism was closer to the truth of the early church than was the Catholic Church, that the Catholic Church was far from history, far from tradition, and that his Calvinism and Protestantism in general, was the form of the original church. This was the historical claim made by John Calvin. In fact, Luther and others also claimed that they were the original church. We're going to look now at one of the greatest church fathers, St. Irenaeus, and I will tell you, spoiler, flat out, he utterly contradicts both Calvin and Luther. So therefore, either St. Irenaeus is lying, or Calvin is wrong, or Calvin is lying, or one, maybe a little bit of both. So either the Protestant reformers are wrong, or St. Irenaeus is wrong. If you think Irenaeus is right, drop a 1. If you think the reformers are right, drop a 2. But then we have to decide which one is wrong here today. Okay. All right. So St. Irenaeus, he was born in Smyrna, now Izmir, in Turkey. He was Greek. His parents were Greek. And his period is like roughly 120, 140 to 200, 203. Okay, I guess that's fairly unanimous. St. Irenaeus is right. Now, unfortunately, logically, this must mean the reformers were wrong. And we're going to see exactly that. He studied under Polycarp. Now, Polycarp is the last known living connection to the apostles and a disciple of John. I am my own pope, so 5. yeah. Okay, fine. Yeah, go against this. Just go against the stream. Now, he was also written about by Eusebius, right? So the man has standing historically. He was known for combating Gnostian interpretations of scripture as heresy. This is important because the Gnostics, the Gnostians, were claiming to be Christians. They were claiming to be the original Christians. They were claiming to be the only Christians, the correct Christians. Do understand that. His primary goal in writing Adversus Heresies was to attack cults that fell away from Orthodox Christianity, mainly the Gnostians and the Marcionites. It is a systematic account and refutation of every Gnostian sect known at the time. Against heresies, or on the detection and overthrow of the so-called Gnosis, written roughly 175 to 185. Now, there are certain scholars that give a shorter time range. Okay, I'm using a larger one because, look, honestly, you'll find a multitude of dates. I'm just taking a fairly broad range here. It doesn't really matter. He wrote it. So he was the Bishop of Lyon in the 2nd century. He was alarmed at the proliferation of Gnostian sects and other groups promoting false doctrines and false knowledge, gnosis. Irenaeus sees Gnostianism as a false path of knowledge, a gnosis, that stands opposed to the true faith of the church. And we need to ask, Marion, welcome. We need to ask, how do we know what is true? And this is something I'm building towards when I do my talks on logic. How do we know what is true? What is the methodology, the process we use for determining what is truth and what is error? So he countered these false sects that stood opposed to the true faith of the church. He called it the so-called gnosis, right? And his work aims to detect and overthrow them, to defeat them, and we have to defeat them if we believe in truth and we believe that that is error. So Irenaeus very meticulously lays out all of the Gnostian mythologies. He points out their logical inconsistencies and he uses logic. We need to learn and understand his logic. He points out their contradictions. Again, that is a logical tool. And he says these things conflict and contradict Orthodox Christianity. And he argues for the authority and apostolic foundation of the Catholic Church. So what do we mean by apostolic foundation? Well, we will be covering that. Irenaeus defended tradition and authority against scriptural reinterpretation and esoteric secret knowledge. We discovered that Calvin, of course, and Luther reinterpreted scripture, but also Calvin explicitly claimed secret knowledge, secret testimony. So after the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Gnostian library in the 1940s, respect for Irenaeus increased greatly. He was proved to have been extremely precise in his descriptions, because prior to that, the greatest amount of knowledge of the Gnostian ideas was taken from Against Heresies, where Irenaeus would write, these are what these Gnostics believe, and this is how we defeat them using Christian truth. Right. So this was an opponent of the Gnostics, and it was discovered that he was very, very accurate in describing them. So he was incredibly honest. So his other books, his demonstration of the apostolic preaching in Greek, is extant only in an Armenian translation, which is probably intended for the instruction of young candidates for baptism. So Against Heresies was not his only work. He's also got the demonstration of the apostolic preaching and others. So I'm busy working my way through Against Heresies right now. Irenaeus regarded Christian teachings and practices as apostolic tradition. And of course, that word is loaded within the Protestant faith. Accordingly, he appealed to the authority of the apostles in defending the Christian faith. Apostolic tradition, he said, must be guaranteed and safeguarded by the unbroken historical succession from one generation to the next. So Irenaeus laid emphasis on the importance of the apostles in Christian teachings and practices. However, to him, the apostles without successors were meaningless. How could you have apostles that passed on a teaching, and then you've got no successors, and you've got a church, boom, that just appears out of nowhere, out of place in history? There had to be a tradition, a succession. This teaching was passed on and passed on from one to the next through a reliable chain of transmission. Right? So the concept of being in the church played an important role in Irenaeus' thought. To him, the apostles were the depositors of the tradition of faith in the church, and the bishops were the guarantors of it. So the apostles left certain traditions, right? That word tradition again. And the bishops were the ones in charge. The bishops were the ones with the authority, and they guaranteed that this deposit of faith, this knowledge was understood and passed on correctly and defended. Historical Christianity, welcome. So the true Christian, according to Irenaeus, is found only in the church. Now, when he says in the church here, he does not mean the non-denominational church of Liverpool, okay? Nor is he referring to the ecumenical church of Outer Mongolia. I believe here he is talking about the Catholic Church. I checked, he was not an Anabaptist, and also I don't think he was a Presbyterian. So it seems that St. Irenaeus was Catholic.